What's up, folks? You're back with Dave Grindle here, chilling in the parking lot, late night, ready to throw down another podcast covering the Unwilling, the rise of zero-fail enterprises, and the change that I and my Avengers team hope to bring to the gaming industry in a positive way. Now, the first segment talked a lot about zero-fail, about my hopes for the industry and how the gaming industry, I feel, can bring much needed change across the spectrum of humane policy and a lot of socioeconomic issues that are found around the world. And I think by the spurring of economic growth and dedicating much more of our, not attention, but our resources to connecting the world, it's hard to overlook the problems that other human beings are having when we ourselves are linked right to them. If you know what I'm saying. Now, if you hadn't heard, you're going to hear it now. Podcasts with me are freestyled. I never necessarily write anything down or even format, even though it's a good idea to structure your conversation with people before you have it. Especially with it being something so important to me, my creative style is to sit down and have a conversation with interested parties, with fans, with other Imagineers, with creative developers, with friends who find mutual motivation to work towards it. And I really established that on the smoke deck in the Navy. Talking to a lot of other gamers, a lot of friends about my idea for a perfect game really brought the Unwilling to a new level, because I was able to deconstruct problems that I had in the series conceptually. I was able to generate more depth, more complexity, and more options for players, future players, by talking it out with fans that have been playing MMOs, who currently are involved in gaming at a role-playing game level, an adventure game level, and sort of what we have always wanted from the gaming industry, what we wanted a game to give us. Now, over the past decade, I've seen a lot of games that, not only appeal to me, but through many ways appeal to such a wide audience, such a vast number of people that bring us all together over these very special titles. I know that the Unwilling could be the game that brings the most people together of all time. Now, and I don't mean that strictly in the way of having the largest fan base, but being the game that gives gamers an opportunity to flesh out their dreams in a way that I think is beyond comparison to what we see in the conventional age. Because every game seems to have a slew of downfalls. And I say that purely having observed them, through playing them, through talking to other fans. It's not... I don't rank the Unwilling against the rest of the games that are already in existence, because I haven't gone through the process of giving the ownership of the Unwilling as a concept to a company or to another group who would then fully develop it. And I think it's an experience that a lot of screenwriters can identify with, songwriters as well, and, designers in every media, that when you hand a product over to somebody else and you take money, you've sold your idea, and how they mold your idea is beyond your control. And I'm sure authors have pulled their hair out at what has come out on screen as a depiction of their work that they have that pride in. Now, with the format for this podcast, informative podcasts about the game and about its construct are going to be 30 minutes in length. And I'll take 5 to introduce and 5 to outro, and then pick 4 subjects to freestyle for 5 minutes about. And for example, tonight we're going to go locations, then factions, then vehicles, then AI, and what your average AI construct and execution is going to be like in the game, what you can expect from NPCs across the board. So in about 20 seconds, we're going to get started discussing location. And as we segue from topic to topic, just know that we can always go back to these, get further in depth with the more discoveries I make, with what comes out as to the concept, the construct of the game. So let's fire it off right now and start out with locations. Now, There is a lot of geography to be covered when we talk about the Unwilling. It being a fantasy game does follow, I don't want to say the rules, but the archetype system as far as locations go. I've always envisioned very rich, open, beautiful landscapes, much like we find here, much like what many fantasy games give to audiences. And I'm not talking about flashing fantasy creatures in their face. I'm not talking about trying to overdo what some games have established as the standard, because I look at games like the Fallout franchise and the Elder Scrolls franchise as open world games that set the bar. And games like Witcher 3 tend to improve on that in the fantasy aspect by fleshing it out more fully. In The Unwilling, the context is of, we would call it the Dark Ages / medieval era, all the way through the Renaissance era. I really put it 9th, 8th century through the 16th century, 17th century, as the architectural style and the flavor of people's accents, their language, their... Though it is different because we do have a different level of education, but when we look to The Unwilling, lush green fields, dense forest, endless tundra, mountains, hills, dune land, desert, marshes. I do think that there is room for every climate to be expressed across the 3 continents. And that's where we get more basic, is there are 3 continents in the most basic outlook, is the Western continent, the Central continent, the Eastern continent. Now, the Eastern continent is a more temperate climate, pardon me, and there is a lot of green, a lot of forest. I do have Gascar being very marshy, with a lot of lakes and rivers dotting and crossing this green landscape, and it has lent to their mastery of water and their excellence as a naval people as part of their cultural heritage. Now, in the north, so that covers the south, right? So let's go continent to continent, and I'll do this right. The eastern continent houses the nations of Vladox and Gascar. They split the continent almost evenly. Now, there is a land bridge, which amounts to about, at its widest, 16 miles from its northern to southernmost point, and it stretches all the way across the reaching sea, which is the main oceanic body of water that separates the central and eastern continents. And that comes from near the southern tip of the eastern continent and stretches all the way across the ocean like a scribble line to connect with the central continent at its southern point. Now, that is entirely inhabited by the nation of Kargoth, which is not as much a barbaric, but a barbaric nation that is very much primal, tribal, and is connected through magic to the ancient roots of the world. Now, there are plenty of seas, and I want to start promulgating the maps for the Unwilling to give people an idea of what they're looking at. But the central continent is split in half, also north and south, between the Empire of Burgundia in the north and the Democratic Republic of Foundros in the south. And they are split by a massive, like an almost seemingly endless mountain range that goes from the east to west coast along the central border, the equator of the continent. And that is where Luftor is found and is mined from, and is the whole source of the conflict for the plot. Now, across the sea, you have the largest continent, the Western continent, which houses the Empire of Silic, which is based, equally between scrub / oasis, lush grassland, and desert. And it also houses the empires of Mirthand. This is more meant for the factions, I guess, but just know that we have 3 continents, plenty of ocean, plenty of land, and plenty of islands to deal with as we look at the scale of this world war. So I didn't do locations justice, I don't think, and I will have to address it again in the next podcast, but let's start talking about the factions. So I'll rattle off the factions that you'll see that are developed nations that we come into in the course of the war flaring up after its stalemate point. And that is the game start point when it comes to chronology. But the factions we'll see playing a role on the Western continent are the Empire of Silic, the Kingdom of Mirthand, the Oligarchy, a collection of very historied with tons of heritage, cartographers, explorers, traders, very much the central economic hub for not just the Western continent, but the Western and Central continents, and very much draws overseas trade from Ladox and Gascar because of their overrunning knowledge of the world and how it works. Now we move to the south of the Western continent and we see jungle, we see lots of forest and lowland, and that houses the nation of Shaldaza, which I modeled partly after Nubia and partly after parts of Romantic era Spain. So that's an interesting mix there. And what is interesting to note is that Mirthand Orvis, being the other kingdom on the Western continent, Orvis, Mirthand, and Shaldaza are all subordinate states to Silic. Now, Silic is the antagonists. They are the empire in the very, not cliche, but already acknowledged source, as empires are often troublesome, especially in eras of expansionism and imperialism. But the Empire of Silic, over the thousands and thousands of years, the many millennia of history that the world contains, has invaded the rest of the world on multiple occasions, having made significant progress on many of them. And today, after hundreds of years of peace, or not peace, but without the hugely hungry, greedy imperialism that Silic is historically known for, under a series of emperors and empresses that are more concerned with infrastructure and the expansion and strengthening of Silic from the inside, recovering from a particularly nasty defeat, pardon me, in subsequent counter-invasion by the alliances made against them. They do, however, hold sway based on their sheer size, their mass, and their population, do threaten at this time, if provoked, to begin another outward slaughter, as they have in the past. And so Shaldaza is directly puppeted, pretty much, by Silic, but also we see a huge interaction between them and Regalia, which is the cartographers and mercantile hub. We do see a close interaction, but I like the similarity between China and Hong Kong with them, as they are allowed to maintain autonomy on the threat of collapsing the economy of the West. Mirthand, I did model after chivalry age France of the Middle Ages, and I do like their flair, but I like how French and Native American blended in the South during the colonization of North America, and so I made them more Creole, like a mix between Creole and classic French, which I think lended for a great population and a great attitude. But I'm running out of time, and I've only... So here's the deal. I'll stretch factions out to a 10-minute segment, so we can cover this all in depth, and then maybe I'll hit up location again if I have to towards the end. And we'll make it a two-parter, because clearly 5 is too much for my rambling self. Too little of a time to cram everything into. Now, check me here. When we get to the Central Continent, we see two factions which start the war, and I'll explain that in the next segment. I'll go to the context of the plot. But we see two nations split. The Central Continent was once such a huge force, politically, diplomatically, economically, and militarily in the world. But this is many centuries prior, before they split into two. And it was formerly named after the bloodline that ruled for over two millennia since its prior state as another nation known as Burgundia. The Burgans ran the central continent from a velveted iron throne, I should say. Now, they split due to a divergence of siblings, as is wont to happen in the world as we know it. Two siblings split. They didn't agree on how to run the empire, as they were poising to take it over, and they ended up sort of killing a great deal of the population of both the North and South in the ensuing war, as people are stupid enough to do in our own timeline. So a lot of life lost, a lot of destruction caused in the fall of Burgundia, and, you know, the second son founds Foundros in the south, and they are committed to the empowerment of the people, and it becomes very much a Greek republic. However, the two of them I wanted to be a mix between Gaul, so Germanic tribes, that early ages Western Europe mixed with the Tsarist Russia of the Middle Ages as well. And they split into two, and they have proceeded to be very conflicted with one another over culture and ideals for the entirety of time after they'd separated, close to 600 years. Now, when they discover Luftor, the North Burgand, the empire, the remnants of the empire still of Burgand, is the first to discover Luftor, as it's named in these mountains, and it's named so for its properties of levitation. Now, obviously, the value of a stone that can fly and has the properties of levitation, seemingly magic, in a world built for an MMO that does not function with magic, with the exception of just 2 locations worldwide so far over the first half of the story that is developing in the background of the game for players, because remember, it's an MMO and there's no final bosses. Like, this world just evolves and interacts with each other at different levels as the player continues their life journey doing whatever they want to do. Now, so we've covered the central continent, and eventually, just to throw a snippet out there and waste a little bit more time, the West throws in their power behind Burgundia, and the East is forced to rally behind Foundros to keep the balance of control over Luftor, as it's developed and experimented with and made into a part of so much between the war machine and people's daily lives. They do start a world war over it, and that is the context of what's happening around them. Now, the East, Laddox built after Arthurian England, and Gascar a mix of musketeers as we see them in France, and Italians, not just in the Renaissance but in general. And this concept of dueling, pride, bravado, mercenaries, corsairs, pirates. I love them, especially since they're the masters of waterborne tasking and activity and crime as well. Let's not flinch away from it. So the two of them, Laddox and Gascar, both inhabiting... Oh, well, let me not forget Kargoth. Now, Kargoth, which inhabits the land bridge, and I would say the median population of all of these, with the exception of the very small nations like Regalia and Libertania, which inhabits a chain of islands off the coast of Laddox, and is home to veterans of all kinds of warfare who have just congealed to become the mercenary center of the world. I'm looking at hundreds of millions in population, tens of millions in population. And we do see, and these cultural differences don't cause a problem. Like, nobody hates each other because of the color of their skin, their background, the way they talk, their standing in life. Most people rally behind their flags because, in difference to how many other fantasy realms, especially the work of George R.R. Martin, produces this image of leadership and nobility, royalty, those in governance really using the people as tools and suck taxes out of them. I mean, very much drawing from our own history, that the rich and the ruling treating the poor and the tools as serfs, peasants, and lets them live in poverty and filth. But no nation has chosen that path in the world of the unwilling. Education has always been a thing. Feeding and what, like giving the people a life and the possibility to pursue themselves has gained a lifetime supporter for the flag and the throne of every nation. Maybe that makes it easy to understand for me as the author of The Unwilling to feel why people by the millions would pick in each nation would pick up swords and shields, don armor, and choose to fight, kill, and die for their flag, for their country. And it makes for a better story, in my opinion. Now, Kargoth is separate from that in that it simply exists. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, it's been stuck in a state of isolation from the world for so long, and they've got their own agenda, and they hate people coming through, although throughout history, certain exceptions have been made. But what I like about Kargoth is Kargothians are the only race, the only faction that can be chosen from that has anything to do with magic. And we'll talk about classes and professions in another thing. Let's hop over back to location. So, especially in the context of The Unwilling as a game and not just something I'm trying to get you familiar with the feel of, if you've played Mountain Blade, you know what I'm going for. If you've played Warband, you know what I'm going for in the feel of a game. And as an MMO, I find that to be so much better. So much better than WoW. Let's keep it real. I mean, would you rather exist on one giant low-res world map? And I mean, Mountain Blade, not exactly a great representation in that manner, but it's essentially 2D. It is essentially 2D. Now, we're going to be talking about the locations in context of the game and not as a story right now. Because I'm thinking what an incredible world it could be if, almost like a risk board, but to scale, the world is generated. Again, I will segue and say, if you are not familiar with Mountain Blade Warband, Google it, YouTube it, watch a couple clips, don't kill yourself on time, because some people that do Let's Plays have hour recordings, and I would just tell you at that rate, if you've got a PC that you game on, hop on there, buy it from Steam, it's usually cheap, get on ModDB, get the mods, and start playing Mountain Blade Warband, and you will know exactly the construct that I want to enact for The Unwilling. Because we take an almost massive portrait of a map, and this is The Unwilling again. Okay, let me make that clear, not Mountain Blade, but let's take a huge portrait. Now, for me, I always like to think if I ran from one end to the other of a map in Grand Theft Auto, how long would it take me? And that is what would be really impressive. Now, I think, how long would it take your character to walk across a continent, hop in a ship that is a conventional Age of Sail ship, and then land across the ocean, start walking across that continent, get in another ship, sail across that ocean, get off, walk across the third continent? To me, in-game, that should take a player 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and that is not doing justice. That is not a one-to-one scale. Now, I don't know why we couldn't make a one-to-one scale, but I look at the map of The Unwilling, and I see 8 oceanic bodies between oceans and seas, and I see 3 huge continents with multiple nations on each continent, and I think that there is so much adventure to be had within one's own place of character origin, let alone the entire world, that if we generate a gigantic open world that would truly give the player, that would make a player feel as when they've traveled the world, that they've really accomplished something, because it's not easy. I mean, I planned to talk about AI, and maybe this should be it. Again, I will cite the basic foundations, idealistically, of games that I am a huge fan of and draw inspiration from throughout the context of building the Unwilling as a game. But when I think of the fact that it does take your character a length of time that is measured in day-night rotation to get from one end of a territory, a faction, to the other, you're not just like lords and armies from other factions will not go out of the way to attack you and two other guys that you hired to travel with you as you're on trading missions. If you work as a mercenary, you're not approached either. It's once you have the flag and the endorsement of the faction that you choose to work for that you're pursued by enemy combatants en masse. Now, what's interesting is in the beginning, when you're traveling from place to place, you are set on by bandits, by pirates, by criminals, by attackers who come in groups from 1, 2, and 3 up to 30 and 40. Clans and huge groups of criminals attack you, they try to ambush you, corner you, and the game mechanics, when it comes to the realism of individual arm control for defense and attack, the utilization of ranged weapons and how that goes down, the effect of cavalry in a battlefield of infantry, and really accepting that historic battles weren't 20, 30, 40,000 dudes at one time. That yes, many huge battles and chronicled battles were that massive, but most fighting was armies of a few hundred on each side clashing over this area or another, because lords and local leaders and officers would conscript people as they went. And it wasn't like these people had top-of-the-line armor, and this ain't Lord of the Rings, dude. This is Braveheart. You saw how Braveheart went down? That's real shiz. And I think people getting involved in that, when it takes players and AI working side by side, both in local, regional, and factional government, the infrastructure of a faction, building villages into towns, towns into cities, cities into metropoli, building castles and fortresses from the ground up, and with airships playing such a crucial role, the establishment of fortresses and air depots, which are refueling, resupply stations for everything from, local privateers and defense patrols to, this is where major air bases are going to look spectacular with the combination of medieval architecture and Gothic architecture, Renaissance architecture, with working with the resources they have, stone, wood, mortar, the classics, man. What builds a great looking game from a period fantasy, combined with the technology of turning Age of Sail warships into flying machines that are believable, with a mathematically derived system of engineering on how the float stone, the luft ore, is applied to the engines dispersed through the ship, and what makes a 40 cannon wielding heavy frigate able to fly, able to maneuver in every direction. X, Y, and Z. I mean, I worked it out so that it would be believable, and making the transition and basing this, hoping for it to be picked up and made the flagship of VR in its perfection. Thinking about what it would be like with two player controlled, with AI airmen on board and players on board, as two frigates flying over a battlefield that is both player and AI as well, fighting on the ground, trying to get an advantage and shell the other side with grape shot, but they're accosting one another, both serving as defensive forces for their armies. And you, whether in conventional game style or VR, are an engineer on board that ship, dodging splinters, debris, cannonballs, like in the choking smoke, trying to fix shit in the middle